February 8, 1945. Dawn breaks cold over the Italian Apennines. Snow clings to jagged peaks. Below, in the frozen valleys, men crouch in muddy foxholes. Their breath rises in white clouds. Their hands grip rifles with numb fingers. These are soldiers of the 92nd Infantry Division. Black Americans. Men who crossed an ocean to fight fascism abroad while facing hatred at home. Ahead, the Gothic line waits. German bunkers carved into mountainsides. Machine gun nests hidden in stone. Barbed wire stretched across frozen ground. Hitler's generals called this barrier unbreakable. They laughed at the idea of black soldiers attempting what white troops had failed to achieve. The men waiting in those foxholes heard those laughs. They knew what their own officers whispered behind closed doors. They understood the double burden they carried, proved themselves as soldiers while the world questioned their humanity. A whistle cuts through the mountain air. Artillery thunders. The ground shakes. The Buffalo Soldiers rise from their positions and move forward into history. What brought these men to this frozen mountain was a story written in two betrayals. The first betrayal was America itself. In 1945, the United States military remained strictly segregated by presidential order. Black soldiers trained in separate camps. They ate in separate mess halls. They were commanded almost exclusively by white officers who often viewed them with suspicion or contempt. The War Department held a quiet belief that black men lacked the intelligence and courage for combat. Despite the service of 200,000 black soldiers in World War I, despite the original Buffalo Soldiers' legendary service on the frontier, military leadership in 1941 still debated whether African Americans could fight at all. When the 92nd Infantry Division was activated in October 1942, it carried the weight of those doubts. Named after the original 92nd Division from World War I, these men inherited a proud but painful legacy. They trained at Fort Huachuca, Arizona, a remote desert post where segregation was absolute and dignity was rationed like ammunition. Their white officers arrived from southern states, bringing prejudices carved deep by Jim Crow. Training was deliberately inadequate. Equipment came last. Criticism came first. When black officers were appointed, a rare and hard-won achievement, they faced sabotage from their own command structure. The men themselves came from every corner of black America. Sharecroppers' sons from Mississippi. Factory workers from Detroit. College students from Howard and Tuskegee. Teachers, preachers, laborers, dreamers. All of them volunteered knowing they would fight for a country that denied them the right to vote, to eat in most restaurants, to walk freely without fear. They endured this because they believed in a simple truth. Proving their worth in combat might open doors that politics had sealed shut. In July 1944, the 92nd Infantry Division deployed to Italy. They joined the grinding campaign to push German forces northward through the Italian peninsula. The war here moved slowly, viciously, through mountains and fortified towns. Every mile cost blood. The division was assigned to the 5th Army under General Mark Clark. Their sector, the western coastal region of Tuscany, facing the formidable Gothic line. But even before they fired a shot, another betrayal waited. German propaganda had already painted them as subhuman. Nazi racial ideology placed black people at the bottom of their twisted hierarchy. German soldiers received explicit instructions that capture by black troops meant dishonor. Radio broadcasts mocked their deployment. Leaflets dropped on German positions assured defenders that these inferior soldiers posed no real threat. The men of the 92nd found themselves trapped between two racist armies, fighting for one that doubted them, against another that despised them. Yet they marched forward anyway. The Gothic line represented Germany's last hope in Italy. Stretching 200 miles across the Italian peninsula from the Ligurian Sea to the Adriatic coast, this defensive barrier had been under construction since 1944. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring poured resources into making it impregnable. Concrete bunkers reinforced with steel. Minefields layered 3 deep. Artillery positions carved into mountain rock where Allied bombers couldn't reach them. The terrain itself became a weapon. The northern Apennines rose in steep ridges covered with dense forest. Valleys funneled attackers into killing zones. Rivers ran swift and cold, their bridges demolished. Roads were few and easily defended. Winter turned everything to freezing mud. By February 1945, the Allies had been hammering at the Gothic line for 6 months. British, Canadian, Brazilian, and American divisions had all launched offensives. They gained yards at terrible cost. The German defenders, though outnumbered and short on supplies, held firm. Every attack failed to achieve breakthrough. The 92nd Infantry Division inherited one of the worst sectors. the Serchio Valley region leading toward the coastal town of Massa. Here, German positions dominated the high ground. The 148th Grenadier Division held the line, veterans hardened by years of combat. They fortified every hill, every farmhouse, every stone wall. When German commanders learned that Black American troops would assault their positions, their response was documented in captured communications. One officer wrote to his superiors calling it an insult to send Negroes against German soldiers. Another predicted the Americans were throwing away inferior troops on a sector they have abandoned hope of breaking. German propaganda radio broadcasts escalated. They told their soldiers that black troops were criminals released from prison, wild and undisciplined, easy to kill. They promised swift victory and medals for those who stopped this offensive. The High Command in Berlin approved special commendations for units that repelled the 92nd. The message was clear. Defeating these soldiers would be humiliation for America and proof of Aryan superiority. American command offered little better support. The 92nd received less artillery support than white divisions. Their requests for air cover were frequently denied. Intelligence briefings were delayed or incomplete. Supply lines operated on lower priority. Some white officers openly questioned whether the mission was designed to fail, a cynical test to prove black soldiers couldn't fight, justifying continued segregation. The men in the foxholes understood all of this. They read the doubt in their officers' eyes. They heard the German taunts across no man's land. They knew that failure would condemn their race to continued oppression, while success would be minimized or credited to white leadership. The burden was impossibly heavy. But on February 8, 1945, as dawn broke over those frozen mountains, the soldiers of the 92nd Infantry Division fixed bayonets and prepared to shoulder it anyway. They would attack the Gothic line not because it was achievable, but because their dignity demanded they try. Private First Class Vernon Baker crouched in his position that morning carrying more than rifle and ammunition. He carried every insult he'd endured since childhood in Iowa. Every door closed in his face. Every water fountain marked "whites only." Every moment he'd been made to feel less than human. Baker had joined because his country called. But at Fort Huachuca, white officers made him and his platoon dig latrines for weeks while other units trained. They were given broken equipment and blamed when it malfunctioned. When Baker scored expert on the rifle range, his instructor suggested he'd cheated. Now, on this frozen mountainside, Baker knew the stakes. If he died, the newspapers back home might mention it on page 12. If he succeeded, they would credit white officers. If his unit faltered, even from impossible circumstances, it would be used as evidence that his entire race was inferior. Other men carried similar burdens. Staff Sergeant Edward Allen from Alabama had been beaten by police for trying to register to vote in 1940. Corporal James Williams left a wife and newborn daughter in Chicago, where he couldn't get a factory job despite his engineering degree. Lieutenant John Fox, one of the few black officers, remembered being forced to sit in the back of military buses even while in uniform. They weren't fighting just for victory. They were fighting for the right to be seen as men. The mission itself was designed for failure or glory. There was no middle ground. The 92nd's objective: break through German positions on Monte Castello and surrounding peaks, penetrate the Gothic line's main defensive belt, and open the route toward the Po Valley. Military analysts estimated such an operation required 3-to-1 numerical superiority, massive artillery preparation, and total air supremacy. The 92nd had none of these advantages. Their sector covered 12 miles of mountainous terrain. German observers on the heights could see every movement. The single approach road was pre-targeted by enemy artillery. Minefields blocked the obvious paths. Machine gun positions interlocked to create crossfire zones where nothing could survive. The plan called for a night approach across exposed ground, followed by direct assault at dawn. No deception was possible. The Germans knew exactly when and where the attack would come. They had 6 months to prepare. Infantry would advance without tank support because the terrain was impassable for armor. Artillery preparation would be minimal to preserve surprise, though there was no surprise to preserve. Once committed, retreat would be nearly impossible. Wounded men would have to be carried down steep slopes under fire. Field manuals stated such an assault had less than 30% chance of success even under ideal conditions. These were far from ideal. Yet the tactical impossibility contained one advantage the planners hadn't considered: German overconfidence. Their racism blinded them to danger. They expected easy victory. That arrogance would become a crack in their armor. Colonel Hans von Rohr commanded the 148th Grenadier Division's sector facing the 92nd. He was a professional soldier, 20 years of service, veteran of Poland, France, and Russia. He knew his business. When intelligence reported Black American troops assembling for attack, von Rohr reviewed his defenses with satisfaction. His men held the high ground. They had ammunition, food, and fortified positions. The weather favored defenders. Every advantage belonged to Germany. He told his officers the coming attack would be brief and unsuccessful. He authorized increased rest periods because he anticipated minimal combat. Some German soldiers played cards in their bunkers the night before the assault, confident of easy killing. German propaganda had done its work thoroughly. Many soldiers genuinely believed Black troops were cowards who would break at the first casualties. Officers assured men that these Americans had been given the worst weapons and least training. Some defenders joked about the target practice they would soon enjoy. This contempt was documented in letters captured later. One German corporal wrote home, "We face the American Negroes now. They say these are soldiers, but we will show them what real soldiers are. It will be over quickly." Another entry in a battalion diary noted, "The enemy deploys inferior racial units. No serious resistance expected." Von Rohr himself wrote in his command log that the sector was adequately defended against the forces deployed against it. He requested no reinforcements. He saw no need. The Germans had calculated every tactical factor except one: what desperation and dignity could forge in men who had nothing left to prove except their humanity. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Ray commanded the 370th Infantry Regiment within the 92nd. He was one of the highest-ranking Black officers in the U.S. Army, a position he'd fought for through 2 decades of service. He had graduated from West Point in 1920, enduring 4 years where classmates refused to speak to him except on duty. Now he stood before men who looked to him not just as a commander but as proof that leadership wore black skin as naturally as white. Yet above him sat white generals who questioned his every decision. After him marched white junior officers who resented taking orders from a black man. Ray knew the impossible position. If he pushed his men too hard, critics would call him reckless with black lives. If he proceeded cautiously, they would call him cowardly. If he succeeded, white officers would claim credit. If he failed, his race would bear the blame. Other black officers faced similar knives at their backs. Captain John Roosevelt Robinson commanded a company knowing that 3 white captains in the same battalion had requested transfers rather than serve alongside him. Lieutenant John Fox led forward observers while white artillery commanders forgot to relay his fire requests. These leaders couldn't simply order men into battle. They had to inspire soldiers who'd been beaten down by their own army, who understood they were expendable pawns in a larger game. Ray and officers like him gave speeches before the assault that never made official records. Words about dignity, about fighting not just Germans but the assumptions of inferiority, about making history that their children's children would inherit. They were commanders in combat against the enemy, and warriors in a parallel battle against their own command structure. The fundamental question haunted every man in those frozen foxholes. Why die for a country that won't let you live? Back home, their families couldn't vote in most southern states. Couldn't attend decent schools. Couldn't get fair trials. Couldn't sit at lunch counters or swim in public pools. Couldn't walk certain streets without fear. Couldn't dream openly without danger. Black soldiers in uniform were beaten by white police in southern towns. Black officers were court-martialed for refusing to sit in colored sections. Black nurses were kept from treating white patients even as those patients died from shortage of medical care. The WWII campaign, victory abroad and victory over racism at home, rang hollow to many. Some wondered if they should even fight for such a nation. Others argued their blood might purchase rights that politics denied. Private Ernest Jenkins from Georgia had watched his father lynched for the crime of looking at a white woman. Now he prepared to charge German machine guns for the country that had let his father's killers walk free. The contradiction was crushing. Yet something deeper than loyalty to nation drove them forward. It was loyalty to each other. To the man in the next foxhole who understood without words what it meant to be black in America. To future generations who might inherit a better world if this generation bled enough. They fought not because America deserved it, but because their families deserved the America that could be. That moral calculus, buying freedom with blood that should have been freely given, was a weight no soldier should carry. They carried it anyway. Equipment told its own story of discrimination. The 92nd received M1 Garand rifles, but many were refurbished weapons rejected by other divisions. Barrels were worn. Firing pins were weak. Men spent hours filing parts to make them function. When the division requested replacements, they were told supplies were adequate. the same answer given each time. Their artillery support consisted of older 105mm howitzers with limited range. German positions on the high ground sat just beyond effective reach. Requests for the newer 155mm guns were denied. The official reason was logistics. The real reason was priority, and black soldiers weren't priority. Radio equipment was outdated. Batteries died quickly in the cold. Communication between units frequently failed at critical moments. Forward observers like Lieutenant Fox called fire missions that went unanswered because their messages never arrived or were deemed unverified. Meanwhile, German defenders enjoyed the fruits of 4 years of fortification. Concrete bunkers 3 feet thick. Interlocking fields of fire calculated with precision. MG-42 machine guns that fired 1,200 rounds per minute, twice the rate of American weapons. Mortar positions pre-registered on every approach route. Minefields that German engineers updated weekly. The technological disparity was intentional on both sides. Germans investing in defense, Americans underfunding black units. The men of the 92nd understood they would assault superior positions with inferior tools. Their only advantage was the one advantage no quartermaster could issue: the desperate courage of men with everything to prove and nothing to lose. February 8, 1945. 0530 hours. The barrage begins. American artillery shells scream overhead, crashing into German positions. Explosions light the pre-dawn darkness in orange flashes. The earth trembles. 4:15, steel rain falls on the Gothic line. Then silence. In that sudden quiet, whistles blow along the American line. The men of the 370th Infantry Regiment rise from their foxholes and advance. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Ray watches through binoculars as his companies move forward in coordinated waves. They cross the open ground low and fast, using every fold of terrain, every depression, every shadow. German machine guns open fire at 0547 hours. Tracers cut through the darkness like deadly fireflies. Men fall. Others press forward. Mortar rounds explode in black fountains of frozen earth. The distinctive sound of MG-42s, Hitler's buzzsaw, rips through the mountain air at 1,200 rounds per minute. Private Vernon Baker's squad reaches the first German trench line at 0603 hours. Baker goes in first with grenades and rifle fire. Hand-to-hand combat erupts in the narrow space. German defenders, expecting easy targets, find themselves facing soldiers who fight with ferocious skill and determination. Baker kills 3 Germans in close combat. His squad clears the trench in 8 minutes. They move forward without pause. On the left flank, Captain John Roosevelt Robinson's company assaults a fortified farmhouse. German defenders fire from reinforced positions on the second floor. Robinson calls for artillery support. The request is denied. Fire control claims they cannot verify his position, though he's provided exact coordinates 3 times. Robinson makes the decision every infantry officer dreads: assault without support. His men rush the building under withering fire. Sergeant Edward Allen leads the breakthrough, throwing satchel charges through the windows. The explosion shakes the structure. Allen and 5 others storm inside. Room-to-room fighting is brutal and intimate. Germans fight desperately. Americans fight with the fury of men who have been underestimated for too long. The farmhouse falls at 0642 hours. The advance continues. At 0802 hours, American shells obliterate the tower and everything around it. Lieutenant John Fox dies destroying the German counterattack that would have broken the American advance. His sacrifice buys time for his brothers to consolidate their gains and push forward. By 0900 hours, the 370th Infantry Regiment has breached the main defensive line. They hold positions that 6 months of Allied attacks failed to capture. German officers scramble to understand how this happened. The answer is advancing toward them with rifles and grenades and unbreakable will. The breakthrough widens through the morning like a crack spreading across ice. Private Vernon Baker and his squad reach Monte Castello's lower slopes at 1015 hours. German bunkers carved into the hillside appear impregnable: concrete walls, steel doors, interlocking fields of fire. Baker studies the position for 30 seconds. Then he moves. He crawls within grenade range using dead ground the Germans assumed was too exposed. He throws charges into firing slits with precision. When defenders emerge, he cuts them down. His squad follows his lead, clearing 3 bunkers in 20 minutes. By 1045 hours, positions that had held for 6 months belonged to the Buffalo Soldiers. German Captain Wilhelm Schreiber watches this from his command post through field glasses. His hands shake. He reaches for his radio and calls Colonel von Rohr. "They are everywhere," Schreiber reports. "They fight like..." He pauses, struggling with the reality that contradicts everything he believed. "They fight like elite troops." Von Rohr curses. He orders reinforcements forward, but his reserves are already engaged. The 92 ND's attack has fractured his defensive line in multiple places. Plugging one breach opens others. His carefully constructed defenses are collapsing under the weight of an assault he never took seriously. At 1,130 hours, Sergeant Edward Allen's platoon overruns a German artillery position. They capture 4 105mm guns and their crews. The German lieutenant in command refuses to surrender to black soldiers. He insists on being taken to a white American officer. Allen ignores him and orders the prisoners marched to the rear. The lieutenant's humiliation is absolute, captured by men he was taught to see as subhuman. This scene repeats across the battlefield. German soldiers raise hands in surrender, then hesitate when they see the skin color of their captors. Some refuse at first. Others weep from shame that has nothing to do with military defeat and everything to do with the shattering of their racial worldview. By 1300 hours, the 92nd controls the key high ground. American flags fly from positions German commanders swore could never fall. The Gothic line in this sector has been broken. Reports reach Allied headquarters. Initial disbelief gives way to verification. The impossible has occurred. General Mark Clark reviews the intelligence and issues new orders: exploit the breakthrough. The 92nd has opened a door that must be rushed through before Germans can seal it. But the cost is staggering. The 370th Infantry Regiment suffered 37% casualties in 7 hours of combat. Every company commander has been killed or wounded. Platoons are led by sergeants. Squads are led by whoever survived. Ammunition is nearly exhausted. Medical supplies are gone. The men who captured those heights now defend them, knowing German counterattacks will come. They dig into frozen ground with entrenching tools and bare hands. They redistribute ammunition from the dead. They bandage wounds with torn uniforms. They prepare to hold what they've paid for in blood. As afternoon shadows lengthen across the mountains, Vernon Baker stands on Monte Castello's summit and looks back at the ground his unit crossed. The snow is stained red. Bodies lie in patterns that mark the paths of advance. The cost of proving one's humanity is visible in every crater, every fallen soldier, every yard of ground taken. Baker doesn't smile. There is no joy in this victory. Only exhaustion, grief, and the bitter knowledge that they succeeded where they were expected, perhaps even hoped, to fail. Behind German lines, Colonel von Rohr writes his report. His hand trembles as he documents the day's events. He must explain to his superiors how black American soldiers shattered defenses that had held against repeated assaults by white troops. There is no explanation that doesn't indict his own assumptions and the ideology he served. The humiliation is complete. The Gothic line is broken. And the world will have to reckon with what these men proved on this frozen mountain. By sunset on February 8, the accounting begins. The 370th Infantry Regiment reports 947 casualties from a morning strength of 2,560 men. Dead, 214. Wounded, 681. Missing, 52. Nearly 40% losses in a single day of combat. Some companies are reduced to 20 men. Others have ceased to exist as functional units. But the ground they hold tells a different story. The 92nd Infantry Division has penetrated 3 miles into German defenses. They captured Monte Castello, Monte della Torraccia, and 5 fortified positions that Allied intelligence rated as impregnable. They took 347 German prisoners, soldiers who surrendered despite their orders to fight to the death rather than submit to black troops. They destroyed 8 machine gun nests, 4 artillery positions, and breached the Gothic line's primary defensive belt. Field reports from German units paint the picture from the other side. Colonel von Rohr's after-action report to Army Group C headquarters is brutal in its honesty. The enemy attacked with unexpected vigor and tactical sophistication. Our defensive positions were overwhelmed by troops we had been assured would lack fighting spirit. The American Negro soldiers demonstrated courage and capability that contradicts all previous assessments. We underestimated them catastrophically. A captured German operations log contains this entry from February 8, 1545 hours. All defensive positions in Sector 7 have fallen. The 3rd Battalion is combat ineffective. Prisoners report the attacking forces are primarily colored American troops. Request immediate reinforcement and revised intelligence assessment. The word humiliated appears in at least 3 separate German command documents recovered later. One Wehrmacht major wrote to his superiors, "To be defeated by these soldiers brings shame that I cannot adequately express. Every assumption we held has been proven false." German propaganda radio, which had mocked the deployment of black troops for weeks, goes silent on the topic. Berlin issues no statements about the Gothic Line breach. The humiliation cuts too deep for acknowledgement. Allied reaction comes in layers. General Mark Clark receives the reports at 5th Army headquarters with what witnesses describe as stunned silence. He reviews the casualty figures, the ground taken, the prisoners captured. He orders verification 3 times before accepting the reality. Clark issues a commendation to the 92nd Division that afternoon. The language is formal, military, carefully worded. He praises their successful execution of assigned objectives and exemplary conduct under fire. But the commendation circulates internally, it is not released to press. American journalists at the front file stories about the breakthrough. Military censors delay their transmission. When the stories finally reach newspapers back home, they appear on inside pages with minimal headlines. The New York Times runs 4 paragraphs on page 18. Most Southern newspapers don't run the story at all. White officers who commanded segregated units begin requesting transfers to the 92nd. Suddenly, leading black soldiers seems less career-ending than it did a week ago. The change is cynical but revealing. Success makes even racism flexible. Medical stations overflow with wounded from both sides. Black medics treat German prisoners who initially refuse their care. Eventually, pain overrides prejudice. A German corporal with shrapnel wounds accepts morphine from Corporal James Williams, then weeps. Whether from pain or shame or the collapse of his worldview, no one can say. The wounded are evacuated to rear hospitals where segregation still rules. Black soldiers who just broke the Gothic Line must recover in separate wards from white soldiers who never saw combat. Victory on the battlefield changes nothing about water fountains and waiting rooms. Yet something has shifted that cannot be shifted back. Lieutenant John Fox's body is recovered from the rubble of the tower where he called artillery fire on his own position. His sacrifice saved the advance. His heroism is undeniable. Yet it takes 52 years before his family receives his Medal of Honor in 1997. The racism of 1945 couldn't allow a black officer to receive the nation's highest award in his own time. Vernon Baker receives the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions on Monte Castello. The citation is accurate but understated. Like Fox, his Medal of Honor won't come until 1997, when President Clinton finally acknowledges what should have been recognized in 1945. Baker is the only living recipient at that ceremony. 7 black soldiers receive the Medal of Honor posthumously, their valor finally acknowledged after death made recognition safe. In the immediate aftermath, 11,000 soldiers of the 92nd Infantry Division receive campaign recognition. Individual medals include 95 Silver Stars and 1,300 Bronze Stars. The division earns 2 Distinguished Unit citations. The numbers tell a story of extraordinary valor, yet compared to white divisions with similar performance, the recognition is measurably less. The paradox of February 1945 plays out in military planning rooms across Italy. Allied command must acknowledge that black troops broke defenses white troops could not. This fact appears in classified reports and tactical assessments. It influences deployment decisions going forward. The 92nd is given harder assignments because they proved capable, a backhanded recognition that punishes success with increased danger. But segregation remains absolute. Black soldiers still cannot serve alongside white soldiers. They still face discrimination in promotion, assignment, and recognition. Victory earned them respect from some officers but not equality. Back home, news of the breakthrough spreads through black communities despite limited press coverage. The Pittsburgh Courier, the Chicago Defender, and other black newspapers give the story front-page treatment. Churches hold prayer services. Families of soldiers in the 92nd hold their heads higher. The WWII campaign gains new ammunition, literal and figurative. Yet in the same week the Gothic Line falls, black soldiers in Georgia are beaten by police for using a whites-only restroom. In Alabama, a returning black veteran is lynched for wearing his uniform in public. The contradiction is savage. Die for your country abroad but know your place at home. The German humiliation becomes a quiet lesson in military academies and staff colleges. After the war, Wehrmacht officers interviewed by historians admit the February 8 assault forced them to confront the falseness of Nazi racial theory. Not through philosophy or politics, but through the simple fact of bullets and bayonets wielded by men they'd been taught to despise. One captured German officer told interrogators, "We believed what we were told about racial superiority. The Americans proved us wrong in blood. I will never forget the shame of that day, not shame at losing but shame at believing such lies." The breach of the Gothic Line opens the route to final victory in Italy. Within weeks, Allied forces exploit the gap the 92nd created. German defenses collapse across the peninsula. By May 1945, the war in Italy ends. The Buffalo Soldiers helped win that victory. But they return home to a country still debating whether they deserve to vote, to eat in restaurants, to be called Mr. The fight overseas is over. The fight at home continues. February 8, 1945 proved something that should never have required proof. Courage has no color. The Buffalo Soldiers broke the Gothic Line not because they were superhuman, but because they were human, fully, completely, undeniably human. They bled the same red. They feared the same fears. They loved their brothers in arms with the same fierce loyalty. The only thing that made them different was the burden they carried. The weight of representing an entire race with every step forward, every round fired, every inch of ground taken. German officers were humiliated that day, not by superior tactics or overwhelming force, but by the shattering of a lie they'd built their ideology upon. American officers were forced to confront a truth many had denied. The men they dismissed as inferior had just accomplished what white troops could not. Yet the deepest tragedy of February 8 is not the casualties, but the necessity. These men had to die to be seen. They had to prove their humanity in the only currency racism sometimes accepts: blood and valor. They fought two enemies simultaneously, the Germans in front of them and the prejudice behind them, and defeated both at terrible cost. The Gothic Line fell. But segregation in the American military continued for 3 more years until President Truman signed Executive Order 9981 in 1948. The civil rights movement wouldn't gain momentum for another decade. The men who broke that mountain barrier in Italy would return home to broken promises and continued oppression. Vernon Baker lived to age 90, receiving his Medal of Honor at 77, more than half a century late. John Fox's widow was 83 when she finally held her husband's medal. Justice delayed is justice denied, yet their recognition, however late, matters. It tells future generations that valor was always there, even when the nation refused to see it. The Buffalo Soldiers of 1945 didn't just break a defensive line. They cracked the foundations of segregation itself. Every barrier they shattered in Italy weakened the barriers at home. Every German soldier who surrendered to them undermined the logic of white supremacy. Every yard they advanced moved America, slowly, painfully, inadequately, toward the nation it claimed to be. They fought for a country that didn't fully accept them. They died for principles America didn't fully practice. And in doing so, they became more American than America deserved, patriots in the truest, most heartbreaking sense. The Gothic Line was broken in one day. The other lines they fought against would take generations. But February 8, 1945 proved those lines could be broken too.